Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is a podcast about wood framing. On today's episode, I am with the co-curators of the American Pavilion of the 2020 Venice Architecture Biennale, Paul Andersen and Paul Preissner. The theme of the Biennale this year, which has since been postponed to 2021, is called How We Live Together. And Andersen and Preissner's work for the American Pavilion looks at what is probably both the most influential and most overlooked contribution to architecture: wood framing. Titled American Framing, the American Pavilion examines the influence of wood framing construction and what that tells us about this country, about economics, about equality, about infrastructure, and of course about architecture. Both the Pauls are also architects themselves, having collaborated on architectural and curatorial projects together, as well as both of them running independent practices in Chicago and Denver. Both of them also are on faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago. In this conversation, we talk about the exhibition, we talk about the American Pavilion, we talk about what we can learn from wood framing, a subject that, perhaps at first glance seems boring or even kind of, dumb, but is actually really interesting. We talk about where their interest in it developed, as well as how it responds to and relates to the Venice Biennale theme. We also talk a lot about their practices and how they collaborate and how their work shifts between architecture and teaching and writing and criticism. I'm fascinated by the exhibition they've put together and found this conversation equally interesting. I'm really happy to have them on the show. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that is written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. Each newsletter features original content, bonus interviews, and all sorts of other kind of interesting content. If you like Scratching the Surface and want to see it continue, you want to see it live in the world, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details and to sign up, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Paul Andersen and Paul Preissner. I want to start talking about the American Pavilion that you both kind of have curated, or I guess are kind of still curating. It's been delayed a bit. But the theme of the pavilion is American framing. And I want to know where that idea or that concept came from for both of you. How long have you been thinking about this idea of framing?
I guess we started thinking about it maybe 2 years ago. Yeah, maybe a little bit longer than two years ago. So we have been working together since 2013, I think, on various projects, often for like biennales or exhibitions where we've done a kind of site-specific installation as part of the programming or curatorial theme, and so we had just finished 5 rooms for the Chicago Architecture Biennale, and we always start thinking, what is another interesting project we could do together?
Right.
It's kind of, our collaborative work is kind of a side project from our individual practices, and so we try and just do as a habit one a year at least.
Okay. Nice.
And so the cycle of the U.S. Pavilion was coming up, the kind of application cycle. And we had been both working on single-family homes that were both kind of produced out of wood framing, softwood construction as a type. And it just seemed like a kind of interesting project to try and tackle, the kind of nature of softwood framing, because it's boring and kind of anonymous and rather dumb and common, and it's everywhere, and it's entirely kind of unregarded in a kind of intellectual sense within the academies that we teach at and things like it. It felt kind of interesting to then maybe look at it and make it a thing. And the U.S. Pavilion seemed like a nearly perfect venue for that, because it's it's a construction type that we could kind of tie back to the history of the United States and American culture and a kind of ethos of practice. And it also fits the purpose of the U.S. Pavilion, which is a way to kind of exhibit some type of cultural aspect of architecture or art, depending on the year, to the U.S. And I think we generally had also found the U.S. Pavilion traditionally had a model of exhibiting American practices as a kind of group show, which is to say that the
Mm.
exhibitions were always about architects. And we thought it would be interesting to do a pavilion about architecture. Um,
Mm.
and so it kind of just came up from those 3 or 4 things happening 2 years ago, um, in a way, from my memory. I think I
Yeah.
texted Paul and said, like, what do you think about framing? And he texted back, awesome. Like, let's do it. Like it happened that kind of casually, from my memory.
And so, I mean, can I think it's interesting also how you said that it's something that it's this topic that is overlooked or maybe even looked down upon. And I will admit, when I first saw that the theme was American framing, I was like, huh, that seems less interesting than
Uh-huh.
previous years. And as I've done kind of the reading, reading the things that you've kind of put out, that there's this I'm sorry for what I'm about to say. American framing becomes a kind of frame to talk about these other ideas also. How did you pitch this idea to the or let me back up, because I'm not even totally sure how the process of kind of selecting both of you to curate. Did you
Mhm.
pitch a idea, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, well, so you anybody can apply to do it.
Okay.
It's a grant that comes from the State Department,
Hmm.
and the selection process is run both by the State Department and the NEA, and it uh, it's an open it's an open call for for the grant. And so we actually started working on it before that call was open, and we ran a couple of seminars at UIC to learn a little bit more about the topic and start to put together materials for the proposal. And yeah, I mean, we were kind of just you asked how we pitched it. I mean, it was pretty much how Paul described it. I mean, I think to go, maybe just a little bit deeper into the, into that, we understood it to be a particularly American phenomenon in a couple of ways. Um, for one, it is very egalitarian. Everybody everyone's houses in the U.S. are built out of the same stuff when it comes to the structure of the house, at least. So you can't get a better 2x4 if you have more money or something like that. So there's something that's and it something kind of egalitarian about that, and also adaptable. That it's used to build lots of different kinds of things that look very different from one another. It doesn't have a kind of essential aesthetics, I guess, to it that that kind of like communicates some kind of message about culture or society. It's very open. And so that was a big part of it. And that was interesting to us as designers, because that means that there's this thing out there that we're all using. We're not really talking about it. And so maybe instead of it being just a solution to a problem, like you come up with the form or the type or the organization of a building or a house, and then you use this to to build it. Maybe it's worth looking at as a construction system, and to see how tweaks in the system might be able to generate new or provocative forms of architecture. So I mean, that was basically the gist of it. For us personally, it also tied into this kind of history of occasional projects that Paul and I have done, which also have tended to be full scale. We've worked on a lot of exhibitions, and had a lot of opportunities to build things at full scale for those exhibitions. Um, which is a little bit unusual, because architecture exhibitions typically focus far more on drawings or models or texts or other representations of architecture. So it's kind of nice to to have a chance to do that. And, in some of the past exhibitions, and wood framing, gave us both the intellectual project to start, but also, a chance to do another full scale piece for an exhibition. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, that was and that was all part of the presentation to the State Department in our application.
Do you think there's something, you kind of talk about how there's something egalitarian about it, and there are these kind of very kind of unique ideas to framing. Is there something specifically? Do you think there's something specifically American about it? Also, that that you're calling this American framing.
Yeah, so I think I mean, I guess that's in the way it developed in the early 19th century, starting kind of in the Midwest. Uh,
Mm.
it originated in a kind of building context or a kind of moment in time where the way that architecture was constructed required extensive training, guild membership, specialized tools, whether you're doing heavy timber, whether you're doing stone masonry, whether you're doing brick masonry. Like the kind of entry into the production of it was slow and guarded, and it required big teams or heavy equipment to do those things. And so the introduction of, there's a lot of different things that developed at the time, the kind of creation of mass-produced nails instead of kind of forged nails, and stuff like that, introductions of hammers or things, but and the dimensional lumber as opposed to timber. But what it did is the kind of parts of it allowed architecture to be constructed with very few details, crude details. One, there's nothing beautiful in any kind of like traditionally aesthetic way about the connections. They're kind of ugly and sloppy and haphazard and ad hoc. And other than a few standards of spacing, and what you do with headers and things like that, like framing is a pretty dumb and easy thing. And it allowed lots of people to do it, at a time when America was expanding west. The
Right.
Homestead Act, the you know the plentiful resources of the forests in the Midwest. So
Right.
it kind
Right.
of developed as a way for people to be able to build their own things, to be able to build cheaper, faster things, and it kind of fit a particular ethos that American culture had and has always had, which through art or movies or music, which is kind of one that seems generally bored with tradition, is looking for ways to kind of skip the line but still produce something provocative and culturally relevant, and a kind of embracing of sloppiness as its own aesthetic or kind of intellectual principle, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
like the forms of music were not the kind of forms of music that was out of Europe and stuff like that. So I think like for those reasons, like it is a typically American practice, and it's one that was never really embraced elsewhere. Like there is
Mm.
softwood framing in other countries, but it's super niche. It's not a really generally used thing. Some places it doesn't exist at all. Other places, like in Poland, it's literally called American framing when they
Oh, interesting.
refer to the construction type, or so we've been told. So um, like it feels something that's uniquely from here, and it develops such a large swath of our built landscape and still does, and yet has a very like small profile in terms of status, right? Like
Right.
everybody knows it, but no one thinks it's cool, especially like especially at the, I guess, in the world that Paul and I maybe operate in, the kind of like academic or kind of
Mm-hmm.
practice or something. It's not steel or carbon fiber or any kind of weird
Mm.
structural thing. It's just dumb wood framing and is taken for granted. But that's actually what I think makes it really fascinating, to us. And also because, like Paul mentioned about, you can't buy a better two by four, right? Like
Right.
even if you wanted to, and conversely, like even if you couldn't afford to, you can't buy a cheaper one. Like there's just one. It
Mm-hmm.
might come from a different mill, but it's the same. It's always the same thing. I mean, for me at least, like it's always kind of interesting that it's the kind of underlayment of American society in a way, and it kind of contradicts the self idea of our own ideology we have. Like, it flattens all of
Right.
the superficialities of American construction as just kind of one structural frame underneath it, and exposes, like, for me and my like priorities, at least, like the narcissism of the shit we spend our money on to make it all seem different
Right.
when it's not. So it's a really bizarre thing, and felt important to make a subject out of.
I was curious about kind of how you thought about the entire Venice Biennale theme, how we live together, how American framing fits into that. And I think that's where this starts to really connect. And in the kind of introduction to it, you quote the Andy Warhol about everyone having the same Coke, and you make the joke that FDR lived in a wood frame house, Beyonce lives in a wood frame house. Is that's the beginning of where this kind of connects to the idea of how we live together? How do you start to kind of build on top of that this is some sort of egalitarian idea, and kind of connecting to that theme of living together?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Do you know what I mean? Did I
I
kind of
mean, I
phrase that
do,
weirdly?
and it's a tricky one to answer, because on the one hand, the kind of the sort of flat status of framing in American building culture and society is certainly interesting and appealing. But I wouldn't, I personally wouldn't go so far as to say that we are trying to, make a statement about how we should live together, and the kind of moralism. I'm in, when it comes to design, very sensitive to that kind of moralism. Like, I don't like being told I should do things a certain way. I guess mainly because I got into architecture because I like, figuring out how to do things the
Right,
way I'm
right,
not
right.
supposed to do them, and what are some of the benefits of that? And I'm curious about that. So it's a slippery slope in a way. I mean, I do think that, it's an interesting way to think about the subject, for me, or the question of how we should
Hmm.
live together, to think like, okay, well, what if we all start with the same material, and then what can we make of that? And if that material is this kind of like accessible material, it's not something that's like really high tech, or that you need, a lot of specialized knowledge or money or equipment or anything to use. I mean, I think it's a nice starting point. But yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say like that there's something in wood framing that is, kind of like, I don't know, like a kind of lesson or something that, the rest
Right.
of the world should learn from, or something like that.
I mean, I I know what you mean, and I have I'm perhaps going to frame the question in another way, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about this being a subject that is overlooked or ignored, or looked down upon within kind of the academy or the institution. And I'm not totally sure I know how to phrase this question, but I get the sense that it is important to both of you to talk about this, because it is not something that is maybe talked about or taken seriously. And I think there's a certain kind of contrarianism to that I sense in your both of your work individually and also in this project. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is some of that to say, look, this is something that should be taken seriously, or is it, or should be looked at with a more critical eye, or is something that we should be talking about, or is it more of, almost like highlighting the arbitrariness of why some things are taken seriously in architecture and some things aren't? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess it is all of those
Mm,
things, right?
hmm.
So, I guess just the history of our particular topic, and the artistic direction theme of this year's Biennale, how will we live together? The process that we started was well before that was announced,
Mm.
So it's just kind of a strange fit that
Yeah.
you can draw very easy parallels between what our pavilion subject matter was and the general theme. Like it could have easily just as been um, how do you make a car, but ours still would have been American framing. Like just the order of how it came. But I think like it's not. That's not to say that we're uninterested in the general theme, and we actually think that it worked out happenstantially quite nice. That it does fit. And for me, at least, I think one thing Paul and I often have the exact opposite takes on things, and the projects always fit in between those two ways. Like
Mm-hmm.
just in terms of how we work, we spend a lot of time more or less just Xing out what the other person did for a number of months until we get to something that stops revealing either of ours most uh, common habits, right?
Mm.
So then it ends up being a project that isn't Paul's or Paul's, but is
Right.
Paul's. I don't know how that works.
Right.
But so I think like what I've kind of always found interesting about it isn't that is that it's both something that should be taken seriously, but also and critically and intellectually and maybe specially, but because of the exact reason that it's something entirely unspecial and dumb and
Mm.
common and kind of really casual, and it's not a kind of uh, weird, remarkable spectacle. It's normal in some ways, and I think the kind of normal is much more interesting as a kind of intellectual space for me than the special.
Mm.
So in response to like how will we live together, often the general answer is going to be a kind of utopic response or a kind of techno-futurist response. And to me this is kind of, I think, a beautiful response, because in some ways it says the same way we always have, or the dumbest way, or the cheapest way. Like I think there's so many things that don't really give the answer that somebody would expect for how will we live together, which is a question about the future. And your answer is really something um, not even from the past, something just from the present in a way,
Right.
right? Like there's kind of a flat history almost to wood framing. It didn't exist and then it did. It's really undergone very few changes or evolutions. Maybe the reduction, like the move from balloon to platform framing, and a few ways of figuring out some details, but it's been pretty much the same. So I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting. How will we live together is it's kind of an open question, because there's one, no answer, or two, all the answers, which is the same thing. And then
Right.
our kind of response is maybe this subversive one, right? Like you just live
Right.
in the
I
same
would.
way everybody else does, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you started talking a little bit about your process and kind of your collaboration, because that's something that I was interested in talking to you about. And I'm I'm very interested personally in how kind of specific projects relate to the larger practice, kind of the almost like the auteur theory that all of this is part of kind of one big practice.
Hmm.
How did you two start working together, and how does this specific project, American Framing, fit into both your long-term collaborations, but then also your individual practices?
Well, we started working together on a project that was um, a couple of barns for a
Mm.
contemporary art festival here in Denver, and they were only assembled. They were only up for, I don't know, like 6 hours or something like that. I mean,
Oh,
it
wow.
was it was a really brief, quick, uh, light project, and it worked out well. Like somehow, we decided to do it together, and we did it, and we're sort of surprised by the results, I guess. And yeah, it just seemed like it's what Paul said earlier is definitely very accurate. I mean, I think we come from a similar backgrounds. We were both in grad school at about the same time, studying similar things. and in some ways have had very similar reactions to those things. Like we've both, kind of reacted against what we were taught in one way or another over
Uh-huh.
the years, but we've done that in different ways. So I think somewhere we share enough interests and ideals to be able to, to work together well, but have such different sensibilities and aesthetic desires, and that's really important to I think both of our bodies of work or whatever. It seems kind of heavy to say a body of work, but yeah, whatever we do, um, and uh, and so it's always kind of interesting to work together because I don't think either of us in most cases can predict what we're gonna design or how it's gonna turn out, and
Mm.
that's a pleasure for sure. So we absolutely don't agree or get along all the way through, but we
Mhm.
also have been through it a few times now, and we know that it'll turn out to be really good. Especially if I think it would probably scare me if we didn't
Right.
disagree. It would seem like we were, we weren't, there wasn't a productive friction there anymore. That would probably be, something to be worried about, to be honest.
Right.
But and it also seems to work for us really well to just do it occasionally, to not be partners who are working together all the time, and not to just do it once and then, you know, move on. So yeah, I mean, I think we've been very casual about it, and that's helped us.
Yeah, I, I don't remember the kind of beginning of the question, but I do remember that you had mentioned the kind of auteur theory,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
I think I'm not a subscriber to that. In fact,
Mm.
actually, like it's one of the things that drives me up the wall about
Oh.
architectural discourse and architectural practice. Is it seems like architects have bought in and believed the auteur theory of creator even more than maybe like the film people do.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
like it just is. It's crazy. I
I
don't know. Like the
Yeah.
whole
I mean,
Ayn Rand has never done more damage
yeah.
than with the introduction of that to our world. So it kind of drives
Yeah.
me nuts. Um,
I mean, now that you say that though, I feel like that's probably not the right.
no,
I'm not just I'm
it's
not
the
just
right suggestion because it's totally true. And I was just discussing this with a friend of mine who's not an architect. Um, about my field, just like griping about it to him, and he kind of noticed the same thing.
and when I say auteur theory, I'm not interested in like the sole creator or the sole genius. I kind of, when I think about that term, or at least the way that I like to kind of think about it, perhaps in my own work, or even in the way I was posing the question, is I think that a lot of us as designers or architects or kind of people who work in these fields, kind of every project is just a rearticulation of similar interests that we have. I feel like
Hmm.
there's just kind of similar themes that run through everything, and each project or essay or book or show or class is just a different way to articulate these various themes. And I'm kind of interested in what those are for you and how this fits into that. You know what
Yeah,
I mean? It's a little less auteurish, maybe a little less pretentious and heavy.
yeah, uh, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I guess again, like, is the question in terms of how we work together? I think we both start with some open questions on the subject, whether the subject is a particular project. Like, for example, with the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennale, it had a an artistic direction, make new history. So it was
Mm-hmm.
historically focused. We had a particular site, which was a kind of corridor and a really crummy one of that our project, we thought one of the goals is to actually make what's a terrible gallery space into a good gallery space.
Mm.
And so we kind of approached the project that way, and I think we both had the same opinions on that. And then it was about trying to find something that addresses the historic focus, but does it in a way that isn't what our peers are doing, which is for me, I
Right.
see often as like a fetishization of history, or really using only the kind of iconic moments from history as these kind of like
Mm-hmm.
tropes
Hmm.
or symbols or things like that. So we kind of looked into something super historical that also has no real authorship to it, a kind of anonymous form of history, which is why we ended up settling on these kind of walls produced out of glazed structural tile, which you see in just the kind of common municipal buildings and pools
Hmm.
and high schools in the 50s and 60s. Like, it's something that is like, by every definition, historic and of the moment in a kind of genre and architecture of itself, but it also has none of what makes history and architecture fashionable to everybody else. Like, there's no
Right.
author, it doesn't have a strong symbolic presence, there's no kind of story about it or narrative. It was just a kind of quotidian way of doing things. And so then we used that and did something that is both kind of dumb and normal, but also had a really kind of esoteric and specific orientation and look to it, like. So I don't know, I guess that's why, like, for me, it's kind of, it can't be an auteur based one. And this doesn't actually like follow literally from that, but I think, like, it's not
Yeah.
foregrounded by our personalities or our own
Mm.
individual interests so much as just trying to take some general themes and work about them in a much more removed way at first. So
Interesting.
it's
Yeah.
not just a picture of us in 3D space, but
Right.
it's a thing that actually, like, is critical of the world that it's being developed for and within, right? And is kind of like
Right.
illuminating the dominant ideologies that allow it to
Hmm.
even
Hmm.
exist within an exhibition or a building or a site,
Hmm.
and comments on those things. Like, so it's more than just architecture. It's also an idea about architecture, which means it's not an idea about Paul Andersen or Paul Preissner, right? Like, in
Right.
that sense.
Well, so I mean, both of you are practicing architects. You are teachers. You both have written. You've curated this show, curated other shows. As we were talking about before we hit record, that's kind of a practice that I'm interested in, and I'm very interested in the overlap and kind of places of convergence and divergence in those types of practices. How does all of these different activities fit together for both of you in your individual practices?
I mean, I think they fit together. I would say, or at least, like, speaking for myself, I would say they fit together through mostly through intellectual interests, and
Mm,
meaning that, architecture takes a lot of different forms. It's, sometimes it's a building, but and other times it's a model or a drawing or gossip or,
mhm.
an opinion piece in a paper. I mean, it can be, it can take a lot of different forms, and the advantage of working through those different forms, or at least one advantage, is that you can kind of sort through them in different ways, maybe think about them in different ways, in those different forms. So, to write about a subject or to curate an exhibition about a subject and to design something, design a building or design a model, or, any of that stuff is, they're very different ways of practicing, and working through a set of ideas or questions. So, um, I think that's the I would say
Right.
that's the way that it kind of comes together, and it's also the reason for doing more than, like, working through more than one medium, let's say, or form.
Are there kind of like what Paul was saying earlier about this show, especially being also kind of critical at having a critical point of view. Also, are there kind of different positions or different processes of being the architect versus being the critic, or do those influence either side of being an architect? Does that change how you approach it, or then kind of being the critic change how you then go back when you're designing a building?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think we feel like we're critics or curators, even though that's our kind of technical title in this. I mean, I think we approach it differently. Like, we have different training and a different way of practicing and a different way of looking at things. So, like, we we identify themes or kind of broader themes and try and figure out how things and people and materials and histories fit into that. But I think the way we have approached the projects and this one, I mean, this one mechanically is different than the other ones because we are coordinating other people, and it's a little bit,
Right.
it's broader and much bigger, but I think we're still approaching it as two people who produce work and not just assess work in that sense, right? And so it's a
Right.
different set of expertises and opinions that we kind of bring to these and ways of looking. So I think, which is to say that I guess like to make it as a critical project is different than to critique it as a
Mm.
project, right? Like for
Right.
us,
Right.
so
Right.
it's a project that isn't just it understand it's again like it's as an exhibition, it's a number of different parts. Those parts all individually are done to both demonstrate the topic and the theme and the potentials and the shortcomings and the weirdness or whatever and the normalcy, but they're also done to kind of illuminate the conditions that it exists within, right? So for me, that's what makes it a kind of critical project as opposed to just something useful or something pretty or something like
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
I mean, yeah, I think that I agree. I mean, I think whatever we do, whatever I do, I do as an architect, you know, and try to be pretty conscious of that and stick to that. And if it includes criticism, it's from that point of view and through that that way of working. So, you know, I like if I because I also think a lot of the work that we do is criticism, even if it's like designing a building and not writing something, and so it's yeah, that's
Yeah, I mean that kind of gets to as I was asking the question, I felt like I wasn't phrasing it properly because it was almost saying that these are two separate things. And I guess kind of the question that I was asking is how does you know is the architecture a critical project just as much as this exhibition is really kind of what I was interested in. It sounds like the answer is yes.
well, yeah, because I think it's all. I mean, it's all architecture, basically. I
Yeah.
mean, it's
You mentioned earlier that in your collaborative process you kind of cancel each other out, you kind of go back and forth, sometimes kind of go in different directions, and that you go into these projects never knowing where they're going to end up or how they're going to evolve. And I'm curious how that looked in this project and in American Framing. Where did this go that you were not expecting it to?
there are a few parts aspects of it that I do not think were at least part of what I was imagining starting off. I think that one of the one that comes to mind sort of immediately is the book that we're working on.
Mm,
I think that there are, I don't know how widely known this is, but the Venice Biennale, at least like being the selected to be the commissioner slash curator of the U.S. Pavilion, involves not only putting together the exhibition in Venice, but also, or at least can involve a book. It can involve a lot of
right.
programming that's not necessarily part of the content of the show. It can involve follow up exhibitions in the United States. Some people in the past have done really nice work with that.
Hmm.
So something that we didn't really have in mind at the very beginning, but became kind of more a part of the project as we went, was that each of these parts of the project um, could be a chance to generate new content. So the
Mm,
book, for example, most of the content of the book will not be like just taken from Venice. There will be
mm,
probably some photos and some things that document some of what we're doing there, but a lot of it are essays, other photographs and images, and a bunch of new stuff that we hadn't really uh, we didn't have in mind when we started the project, but has come up as like a way to get a little deeper into the
right.
topic. Um, which I guess wouldn't have been entirely unpredictable, given that this exhibition is not the culmination of a bunch of work that's already been done, but
Yeah.
it is meant to open up some discourse. So, but yeah, I mean, I think the book is going to be sort of unusual in its format, and is going to have a lot of stuff in it that just wasn't part of the plan originally, and
Nice.
yeah, and in a way that, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be great. Like I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping. I asked if a book was available or would be available that I could read in prep for this, and I was told not yet.
Yeah,
it hasn't been
it's
written
coming.
yet.
Okay.
Like the people writing essays, Dan Handel, Penelope Dean, Jack Self, David Solomon, Paul, and myself, like our essays are all in progress over the next month or two. So, and then the photographic work is still in progress. Like everything's still in progress for the book.
Yeah.
So
nice. I mean, I can't wait for the book. Penelope and Jack Self I've had on the show, and I'm huge fans of both of their work also.
Oh, cool.
And like I subscribe to Flat Out and The Real Review, so I'm a big fan of the collection of people that you've gotten for this also. My last question, this is a question that I used to close all of these conversations. I'm just kind of interested in what you both are reading right now.
I haven't, other than all these books on the origin and history of softwood construction in the U.S., and maybe because I've been reading lots of those, the only things that I can really remember offhand that I've been reading, and for the last year and a half, has been fiction. So right now I'm working through the Topeka School.
What do you think?
I'm only on the like 20th page. When he's kind of got lost. And ran out of the wrong house, or was in the wrong house and then ran out, recognizing it. And then drove home and went to this tournament, this debate tournament. So I think I like just finished the first debate. So far I really like it. I mean, I've loved all his other books.
Yeah.
And before that, I just finished My Year of Rest and Relaxation.
Me too.
which was great. I think Eileen was a much more harrowing and kind
haven't read that one yet.
Scary book and intense book, but this one was maybe more my general style in fictions. They're both beautiful books. So that's what I've been reading.
I am also a big fiction reader. I have not read Eileen, but I just finished My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And loved it. So I have to go back and read her others. And I also love the Topeka School. So we'll have to talk again when you finish it. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think like they're both great. Ben Lerner.
Yeah.
Moisekev, like perfect books, perfect authors.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Paul, what about you?
I just finished a book called The Story of Edgar Sawtelle.
I don't know that.
By David Rablowski. It's which was great. It's kind of long, but it's really I really liked it. It was a very good novel, I thought. And then just started The Old Man and the Sea. I had never read it.
Nice. I've never read that
my
either.
mom's a librarian, or was a librarian, like a high school librarian, and so every once in a while, when when I'm over past her house or whatever, which has not been that much lately, unfortunately. But sometime before all the virus stuff kicked in, I was there and just grabbed it off the shelf. So and just I think it only takes about like 45 minutes to read, but
I've never read it either. My mom's a middle school librarian.
Oh, nice.
And that's her favorite book. And so I feel like I should read it now hearing you say that too.
It's I mean, I read about half of it and like in the last couple of days, and yeah, it's nice. It's good.
All right, I'll add it to the list.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for doing this. This was such an interesting conversation for me. I really like the way you thought about the show and have put it together, and am just generally a fan of the way you both think about your work. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. That's flattering. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
This episode was recorded on April 27th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.